So in the 1980s, as a way to study this and look at the different trends and how widespread the effects were, the Adirondack Lake Survey Corporation came about. It was a group of scientists who decided that we needed to figure out what the baseline conditions were in the Adirondacks. Where had fish been extirpated from? What areas were doing worse than better, and just to get an idea. So in 1984, they launched a widespread survey of 1,469 lakes all across the Adirondacks. Still one of the largest surveys of this kind that has occurred anywhere in this region, or even in the country. And they really they looked at the chemistry, they looked at fish and other biology, and compiled all this data into one centralized report that could then be looked at by legislators and other policymakers to determine, what was happening and what needed to be done. As a result of this and a lot of other research, in 1990, they signed the 1990 Clean Air Act Amendment. The original Clean Air Act Amendment was signed in 72. In 90, they specifically decided to address sulfate and nitrates as a way to reduce the emissions of those and begin to curb acid rain throughout the region. As a result of that, after 40 years of reductions in emissions, changes in what we were burning in power plants, areas that had lost historic fisheries are now seeing a return to the conditions that were historically present. And you might recognize Paul in that picture there with the trout. That was one of his. Yeah. So just a little overview of what they found. So 1,469 lakes of varying sizes, from very small to quite large, were sampled. 352 of those lakes were found to have a pH below 5, which meant that they were chronically acidic. And then 346 of those were found to have no fish in them at all at that point. So 24% of the lakes that were surveyed. Of those 24%, it was estimated that about 100 to 120 of those lakes had become fishless directly as a result of acid rain. There are other lakes in the Adirondacks that are naturally fishless, but a full 7% of them were as a direct result of acid deposition. And the majority of these lakes were located in the western part of the park. This is due to prevailing winds. The western and especially southwestern side of the Adirondacks is the first to encounter a lot of these acid emissions from the lower part of the state, from the Ohio River Valley. And the geology of that area made them really sensitive to these types of things. They have really shallow soils, a lot of bedrock. And so any acid rain that was falling on that area was running directly into these waters. So the compilation of all this work came out in the 1990 interpretive report. This is what I would consider to kind of be like the Bible of the Adirondack chemistry of lakes. This was an enormous undertaking from this big survey. So the major findings was that sulfate was in fact directly responsible for the majority of acid rain. And that sulfate was originating from fossil fuel production. The other thing that it did is it defined the role of dissolved organic carbon. So DOC, is, as I'll call it, is it's kind of a conglomerate of any type of organic carbon that is dissolved in the water and then found in an aquatic environment. It also classified all the different lake types. So there's 1,469 lakes is still only about 50% of the lakes in the Adirondacks. So there's a huge number of lakes. So what this did is it tried to figure out how all these different types of lakes existed, what their classifications were, soil types, geology, different sizes, depths. And then this also laid the groundwork for the Adirondack long-term monitoring program. We'll get into that a little bit more, but the Adirondack Long-Term Monitoring Program, which was started in 1992, went out and just, the purpose was to sample year-round a subset of lakes so that we would have a continuous record of water quality, and we could track the effects of reductions in emissions to see how we were progressing. So in the lake classifications, we had 6 major types of lakes that were found. They can be broken into either drainage or seepage lakes. Drainage lakes have an outlet, they flow out of the lake. Seepage lakes are your kettle hole ponds, where they get the majority of their water either directly from precipitation or from groundwater influence. And then in these 6 classifications, they were broken into either low DOC or high DOC lakes. Low DOC fall below about 500 micromoles per liter, and 500 micromoles doesn't make sense to you. It's about 5 to 6 parts per million. These tend to be the clearer lakes. A lot of them are the larger, deeper lakes. The high DOC lakes tend to be the smaller, more bog-influenced lakes. And so they have a lot more natural organic material in them. So this is a map of all 1,469 locations throughout the park. And these are the DOC values that were found from that original survey. The size of the dots on this map reflect the amount of dissolved organic carbon that was found in them. So a couple of takeaways from this, you can see that the lakes were fairly well distributed around the park, although the major concentration of them were in the western side. And you can also see that there is a fairly wide array of DOC concentrations, from very low concentrations to the larger dots are the very high concentrations. So the Adirondacks does really have a wide variety of lake types, and then, of different organic inputs going into them. So the long-term monitoring program then came about. They selected 52 lakes from this original survey, tried to get a good cross-section of different lake types, different classifications, high and low DOC, and then also spatially across the park to get a good representation of all the lakes that were occurring. And then then within that, there was the 3 primary lake classification types. And this was intended to be representative of changes that were occurring over a variety of terrain. This map is pink for some reason. We don't know why. It used to be white, but you can actually see the dots a little bit better. So this is the distribution of the 52 lakes around the Adirondacks that were selected from that larger survey. There's also some locations in here from a concurrent sampling program run by the EPA. The long-term monitoring program sampled 12 months a year round. The EPA study occurred only 1 time a year in the summer. So the data sets here were used, they were compared and combined to see how these changes varied across that. And let's see here. But yeah, so we had a good representation. So what we found from the 92 or from the 92 to the present long-term monitoring program is that aside from decreases in the acid rain that we were looking at, something that wasn't necessarily intended to be studied was there was also this increasing trend in the amount of dissolved organic carbon that was being input into these lakes over time. And so I'll show you here some graphs. This is from one of those lakes that was part of the long-term monitoring program. This is Big Moose Lake. If you're familiar, it's down near Inlet, north of Old Forge. Actually, it was the largest lake involved in that program. Was heavily impacted by acid rain. It also has a thin till soil, gets a lot of runoff from the surrounding landscape. So a couple of things to note here. This record actually goes back to 1982. There was another program that was monitoring it before that. So we have a good long 40-year record of chemical changes. So the see here, the sulfate at the top was the main thing that was being looked at as a part of this monitoring program. You can see that it really was steadily declining after after the Clean Air Act amendments, and then declining with those cuts in emissions. And now it's actually kind of starting to level out as we get down here, which is getting close to what would be a background concentration, because the emissions have been reduced to that point. We're starting to see recovery, and the sulfate has decreased down towards baseline levels. The blue is the nitrate, which is also a component of acid rain. The trend here isn't quite as distinct. There's other natural inputs of nitrate into the environment, and there's different nitrogen cycling, but you can see that that has declined as well. The green at the bottom is A and C, that's acid neutralizing capacity. So that is the ability of a water to neutralize the acid that's put into it. So the higher the acid neutralizing capacity, the better its ability to deal with acidic inputs. You see that that was still kind of declining until about 1990. And then now that has also made a steady increase as emissions have decreased. And then the bottom panel, DOC here, is one of the things that we noticed over time. Is it wasn't quite as apparent at first, but as the sulfate has decreased, as the ANC has increased, we've seen this fairly now steady increase in dissolved organic carbon inputs into the lake. And actually, what I was going to say before I remember my point here is one of the benefits of having a long-term data record is you start a study, you gather all this data you're looking at for a specific purpose. 20, 30, 40 years down the road, you may be gathering information that you were not necessarily looking for. And this data can become vitally important as we start to see other issues emerge. So the importance of long-term monitoring, of tracking these changes in the environment, I really can't overstate how that can work out in time here. So what we have here is a map of the changes in that DOC across those 52 lakes from 1992 to 2020. Again, the larger the circle, the larger the increase in dissolved organic carbon over that period. You can see that there was bigger changes in some areas than others, but overall, what we saw was you had a fairly significant increase in the amount of dissolved organic carbon in pretty much every single water across all the lake types, across all the different areas of the park. So that bears a little deeper looking at when we see something like that is that ubiquitous. So why does organic matter matter? So another thing is I will use dissolved organic matter and dissolved organic carbon interchangeably. Dissolved organic carbon is what we measure on an instrument from in the laboratory. Dissolved organic matter is the actual organic matter that's going into the lake, but essentially we're talking about the same things here. So it's an important component of water quality. Carbon is the base of the food chain. Organic carbon makes up everything from the algal growth on the bottom all the way up that is eaten by the grazing insects, which are then eaten by the fish, all the way up the food chain. Carbon is the first and foremost source of that. It's also a regulator of light into the lakes. And by regulating the light into the lakes, it also is a thermal regulator of water temperature. It can combine with different nutrients and help them cycle throughout the water. And then it also works together with photochemical oxidants to drive some of the natural processes in the lake. So organic matter and the amount of it in the water is pretty vital to the productivity of the lake and how a lake functions. So the other component of organic carbon is that it causes a color change in the water. Similar to if you put a tea bag into a hot cup of water, your water starts to take on that brownish color. That's organic carbon. The carbon is leaching out from that tea and it's becoming dissolved in the water. You're getting a color change there as that dissolves. So it's the color of the water is strongly related to how much organic carbon is going into it. And this is a picture of Sue Capone. She was the longest serving member of the ALSC. She worked for 40 years going out in the field and sampling. This is on one of our highest DOC lakes. And, you know, with the snow here, you can see how dark that water is. So that's a very high organic carbon content lake. So a little correlation here, just between the color of the water and the amount of organic carbon in it. As the DOC increases, the color of the water increases. It's an incredibly strong correlation. We have a p-value here that's extremely low, which means that they are strongly related. Basically, the more organic carbon, the darker the water, and that is going to follow the whole way through. So visually here, Bear Pond, which is located in the St. Regis Canoe area. If you're familiar with that, if you've ever paddled through there, in the 1980s, it was incredibly clear. It was acid impacted, not as heavily as some other areas, but it did have a fairly significant drop in pH as a result of acid deposition. You could see to the bottom of the water in 20 plus feet. I remember even in the early 90s when I first came to the Adirondacks, being able to see there. Today, it's much darker. So we have a darker brownish content to it. And then the other part is you can kind of see that this is a little bit greenish as well. The other part of having that darker colored water, that increased organic content, is that it raises the productivity of the water. You have more algal growth and other things, any other natural processes which are occurring in there. So while the very clear water is, you know, aesthetically pleasing to go out and look and you can see the bottom, the picture on the right of today is actually a system that is closer to being in its natural state, with that organic carbon in it. So the relevance of all this, now we have a Secchi disc here. This is one of the ways that we use to measure the color. Very quick test. You drop it down into the water until you can't see it anymore, and you measure that distance. And then we can use that data over time to see how that's changed. So as DOC concentrations increase, it can actually change the trophic status of a lake. Trophic status being really the productivity of a body of water. So a very clean, clear, cold lake would be an oligotrophic lake. Tends to have cold water species in it, like brook trout, lake trout, and other things like that. As you get more organic content in it, surface water can get warmer. You have more productivity. You can actually change the trophic status to like a mesotrophic, which would be more of a cool water with bass or walleye or something like that. So the amount of DOC can affect that. And then understanding how these trends are happening and how these changes are occurring can play an important role in looking at how nutrients cycle, how the productivity of a lake is changing, and how these lakes might respond to other stressors like changes in the climate, warming temperatures, increased precipitation. So knowing how these changes are occurring and what they might continue to do in the future is very important. So this is just kind of a summary of the different drivers and how this is occurring. So as acid deposition has decreased, we've seen an increase in the amount of dissolved organic matter in the water. As you reduce the amount of acid deposition, the mobility of the dissolved organic carbon increases. So you have more decomposition in the forest soils, and that allows that content to flow into our lakes. The other change, or the other driver to this, is climate. So as you have a warming climate, you have increased precipitation. That increased amount of precipitation flowing across the landscape pulls more of that organic carbon that is now increasing in the forest floor and lets that enter into the lakes as well. Then the other climate driver being temperature. As you increase the temperature, you also increase the amount of decomposition and the mobility. So when you have all three of these factors happening somewhat simultaneously, you can get substantial increases in that DOC content, and you can have those change, or that rate of change can really increase quite quickly. So one of the things that that we're a little concerned with is the effect that browning may have on water temperatures. So as we get an increase in DOC, DOC can absorb sunlight. It can increase the temperature of the surface water, but it also stops the sunlight from penetrating as far down into the water. So at the same time, you have warming surface waters and darker surface waters, but you have colder water underneath. The problem with that is that the surface water is staying warmer for longer throughout the year. You have warming Mays and then warming Septembers and Octobers. So you have a stratification of your lake that's occurring for a longer period of time. And the stratification is it's becoming more defined, where you have this really hard layer of the oxythermal layer in the middle. You have a nice warm surface and then a cold bottom, and then it's staying that way. While that cold layer underneath can be beneficial to cold water species like trout, having that stratification occurring over a longer period of time is causing the loss of oxygen from the deep water. So while you're maintaining this cold water underneath, you're also losing oxygen because the lake isn't mixing as much. So we call this an oxythermal squeeze. And what we're seeing is that the habitat for cold water fish during these warm summer months is actually decreasing. We have a local case study for that. We do work with Upper Ausable Lake, that is in the Adirondack Mountain Reserve. Some of our other colleagues have been working and taking measurements up there for about the past 6 or 7 years. So we have some data that isn't quite as long as our long-term monitoring, but we actually have a point from the 1980 survey. So we can see that DOC in Upper Ausable Lake, which is also a nice deep lake that has a cold water fishery, has also been increasing over that time. Not quite as quickly as in some other places. It was not hit as hard by acid rain. So the acidification part of that is less of a factor, but the warming climate is. So some temperature data that we've collected from there. This is for just last summer, which actually happened to be a little bit on the cooler side. What we do is we measure the temperature and the amount of dissolved oxygen in a profile down through the depth of the lake. And what we have here is in the green areas, that is habitat that would be suitable for brook trout based on the amount of dissolved oxygen they need and the amount and the temperature they prefer. So you can see that started sampling in May. In June, everything was still in the green, but by July, we had a fairly warm July. Much of the dissolved oxygen at the bottom of the lake had been used up, and now the surface water had warmed, so that you see that squeeze right in the middle there, where there's a very small layer where those fish are going to be able to be successful and comfortable. And then as we go on, we can see that that increases as we get later in the year and the water cools. And then by October, when we have turnover, that redistributes the oxygen through the lake, and the fish become happy again. This is the same data. This is taking into account lake trout. Lake trout are less temperature tolerant, but they're more tolerant of lower dissolved oxygen. So you can see that they have a little bit more room, but there's no green in the middle there. They're living in a stressed environment from July right through to September, because they can't tolerate those warmer temperatures, even if they can get a little bit deeper where there's less oxygen. So this is the concern for not only this lake, but there's a lot of lakes in this situation around the Adirondacks, where despite the fact that the acid rain is decreasing, despite the fact that the bottom water is staying cooler, we're losing that dissolved oxygen as a result. So current research may have seen this. This received a lot of press back in the late spring. Big study by some folks at Cornell looking at exactly this. How the Adirondacks were going to fare as we had increasing temperatures and this loss of dissolved oxygen. They took a lot of this data from our 1984 survey and then the long-term monitoring, as well as data that they had from lakes that they had studied, and then did some analysis of it, did some modeling, looked at what types of lakes were going to be susceptible to these things and what the overall picture was. So some of the findings, what they saw was that in 1980, 23% of the lakes in the Adirondacks were considered very clear. Had a larger number that had nice, clear, clean, deep water, although that they were acid impacted. But currently, only 5% of those clear lakes remain, and that only 1% of the Adirondack lakes were considered deep, which would be deeper than 30 meters. One example of this is Lake Placid. Lake Placid is a very deep lake. It's very clear. So that would fall into that category. But those lakes in the Adirondacks are relatively rare. Most of the lakes we're dealing with are relatively shallow, less than 15 meters. And as DOC increases, we're getting fewer and fewer clear lakes. So the takeaway from their study is that deep and clear lakes are going to need the most protection going forward here as surface waters increase in temperature, and as we start to lose the oxygen. We need to identify these lakes and determine which ones are going to remain as a refuge for these cold water species, like lake trout and brook trout. Brook trout being the New York State fish. It was once ubiquitous throughout the Adirondacks. It has been extirpated from 95% of its original habitat. So identifying which of these lakes that we need to look more closely at is important going forward. And I kind of went over my conclusions, but so yeah, with that in mind, we need to look at how we can determine what's happening with some of the other lakes and do our best to protect them from other potential sources of impact, whether it's invasive species or things like that. So one of the things that we're doing going forward, starting in 2025, is we're starting a study called the Survey of Climate Change in Adirondack Lake Ecosystems, or SCALE for short. This is a consortium-based study. Ausable Freshwater Center is going to be doing a lot of the field work for that. We're working with researchers at Cornell, RPI, and Syracuse, and looking at other metrics that will help us determine the future of the changing climate in Adirondack lakes. So aside from just the DOC and things like that, we're surveying 500 lakes across the Adirondacks and seeing what the different characteristics of the dissolved organic matter are, using tactics like eDNA, which is environmental DNA, to look at how the fish species are changing as a result of a changing climate. Isotopic sampling, which is seeing how the food web is moving different things through and up the food chain, looking at greenhouse gas emissions, mercury, and other ionic chemistry that we can link back to these historic databases, and just to get a better picture overall of how other lakes are performing out there, how they've changed since this initial 1984 survey, and create a new baseline for information that we can look at going forward as we encounter some of these other challenges. And so we have here some of our partners we'd like to thank who have worked on this with us. And I would take any questions.